everyone. My name is Cassandra Lores-Montano. I'm a rising senior at Wellesley College, where I major in Women's and Gender Studies with a concentration in Chicana Latina Studies. And this summer, I had the privilege of working at New York University, where I've developed my research project, Está, Café, Brown Berets, Gender, and the State. So the Brown Berets were a paramilitary organization that were most active from the late 1960s to the early 1970s, and the first chapter was established in East Los Angeles, and chapters spread nationwide soon after. But what they all had in common was that they served Chicano community interests. So when I first began researching the Berets, I noticed that women seemed to be missing from the historical record. In scholarly accounts of Beret activity and in interviews with the leadership, few, if any, women were ever mentioned. I dug a little more and found recent work by Chicana scholars seeking to remember and reinscribe women into the dominant narrative of the Chicano movement. I positioned my research within this greater project of historical intervention. In my work, I deconstruct the process by which women's names and contributions are forgotten or erased from the historical memory of the Berets and the Chicano movement. I argue that the cultural nationalism that fueled Beret politics and state intervention on behalf of LAPD and FBI both worked in tandem to do two things. The first being shape the historical memory of the Berets, and the second being to shape the gender dynamics of the Berets. So I'd like to share a bit more of the organization's history. Before the Brown Berets were known as such, they first existed as the Young Citizens for Community Action. Victoria Castro served as the organization's first president, and the group was comprised of mostly high school students who were concerned with addressing issues of educational inequality, like high Chicano dropout rates and racism perpetuated by educators and administrators. They took their grievances to the school board, but faced intense resistance to making any changes. So there was a growing frustration with working within the system, and this prompted the organization to take a more militant stance. So in the summer of 1967, the organization slightly altered its name from the Young Citizens for Community Action to the Young Chicanos for Community Action. And changes in the leadership soon followed in the fall of 1967, as Victoria Castro left the organization and David Sanchez became the president. It was under David's leadership that the YCCA transitioned into the Brown Berets paramilitary structure, and their immediate goals shifted to address police brutality in their communities. So in this image, you can see the Brown Berets in full force. They adopted uniforms which were worn by members when they would march or participate in public demonstrations. The iconic article of clothing was the brown beret. And what you can also see in the picture is that the leadership in the front is comprised of mostly men. And you can see Gloria Arellanes here, who was the only female minister. She eventually became the Minister of Correspondence and Finance for the organization, but that was it in terms of women in leadership for the East LA branch. And so there is a precursor to the lack of women in leadership positions, beginning with the moment when the Young Citizens for Community Action became the Young Chicanos for Community Action. This change served as a marker for their engagement with the greater Chicano movement and their identification with the rising sense of cultural nationalism. A little over a year ago, the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center invited former leaders to speak on the founding of the Berets. And you can see David Sanchez, the former minister, on your right. And in their discussion with the former prime minister, David, he stated, we gotta get more militant now. So we changed the name from the Young Citizens for Community Action to the Young Chicanos for Community Action. Once it became Young Chicanos for Community Action, a lot of people left. Paula Crisostomo, she left. She couldn't handle it, the Chicano thing, end quote. And so Paula's here on your left. And I remember hearing him say this about Paula, that she couldn't handle Chicana politics, and I felt really confused because throughout my research, I had identified her as an active organizer in the high school walkouts. She was also a regular writer and distributor of La Raza and Chicano student movement, both community-produced newspapers and both explicitly espousing Chicano politics. So why is it that David would attribute Paula's departure from the YCCA to her finding Chicana politics too radical? How is it that David could make this claim even 40 years after the fact? I argue that an erasure like this stems from two different things. One is the sexism embedded in cultural nationalism, and the second is the absence of women's names from state records. The cultural nationalism which fueled Chicano and brown beret politics made la causa, or the cause, centered on the men. These accompanying images serve as visual representation of political power embodied in the man. They are both from scholar Ernesto Chavez's personal archive of the Chicano movement. And on the left, we have a rather iconic image. It reads, Mi raza primero, or my people first. And as you can see, the person is faceless. It exists so that every man, quite literally, can see themselves as political agents. And the image on the right is a recruitment flyer for the Berets. They targeted vatos locos. So you see a disheveled man in the left side of the image, and he's holding an alcoholic beverage. And then on the right, you see him after he joins the Berets, and he's looking clean cut in their uniform, and he's labeled a revolutionary. So the message seems to be that in order to be a revolutionary and harness political power, you had to be a man. This understanding is at the heart of David's erasure of Paula. This is why he claims that Paula couldn't handle Chicano politics. Another aspect that shapes the historical memory of the leadership in the walkouts is the role of state intervention. There were a series of arrests that followed the high school walkouts, and those arrested were all men, and they became known as the LA 13. So because of this pattern of arrests, women's names don't exist in state records. There is simply no bureaucratic paper trail leading to the women. And I believe that this was because of bias that led police to underestimate women's role in the organizing. And the highly public nature of these arrests contributed to the way that brown berets and the Chicano movement activity came to be known as male-centric. These names and faces are what go down in history and live on in the greater historical memory. And so, additionally, while the men were being arrested, the women were the ones on the ground continuing the movement. In the Berets specifically, the women had already been working in separate spheres because of sexism, but this was even furthered by the physical removal of male leadership when arrests were made. And as they worked in exclusively women's spaces, the women began to recognize their collective power. And as state intervention escalated and created paranoia within the organization, their power was weakened a lot. And as a result, the women of the East LA chapter ended up resigning, and they created an autonomous organization called Las Adelitas de Aztlán. And a quote from their resignation letter read, "We have been treated as nothings, not as revolutionary sisters." And again, you can see Gloria Arellanes here on the left, and then in the middle, she's with her core group of women that she ended up leading because she was the only female minister, so all women in the organization reported to her. And then on the right, you have the recruitment flyer for the new organization, Las Adelitas de Aztlán. And I found most of these images from Gloria Arellanes' personal archive on the movement. So if it weren't for historical intervention like this by Chicana scholars, then the dominant narrative constructed with the glaring omission of women's contributions would be all too easy to continue.